And one. And welcome, everybody. Today, I'm here with Grant Cameron and Don Schmitt, and we're celebrating Boxing Day here in the States. But today, we just kind of wanted to bring Don on and discuss some latest news in the community. I think I first approached you, Don, about this Roswell Journal that has made it into the news over the last month. But first, let's welcome Grant Cameron. He's kind of my co-host here today. And thank you, Don, for joining us the day after Christmas.
And this time, let's hope I have a better connection, as I lost as far as my scheduled appearance at the last time with the panel. But so far, so good.
That's right. That's right. That was the start, actually, of a lot of technological problems with various people, and me, Grant. And actually, I think our last interview, Don, Grant's connection dropped out for the last 40 minutes. So you and I had some alone time, but Grant's ready this time. He's going to start us off with some questions. And I already gave you a lead off.
No solar flare, yeah.
We have Roswell making news with this journal over the last month. So I wanted to get your thoughts and comments on that.
Well, I'm still under, because the final episode happens to be this very evening after this interview. And so I obviously I can't give away anything, but I can describe, for example. It's one of the things that, and Grant knows this as well as I do, because he's always been very supportive, and he's even stood by us at times that we may have jumped the shark, so to speak. Because one of the problems in dealing with a highly documented event such as Roswell, you are dealing with more than just witnesses. You're dealing with more than just particular sites involved. In this case, you're dealing with both military and civilian witnesses, but then you're also dealing with potential video, film, photographs, documentation, and then most important of all, you're dealing with the possibility of physical evidence. So as much opportunity there happens to be as a result for the smoking gun, for the Holy Grail, so to speak, there's also tremendous room for error, because you have to explore and investigate every possibility. And without saying, every new lead isn't just a replica of a previous lead. It's something new altogether. I don't care, as I described, for all the times that we have had false leads on possible physical evidence, fragments of alleged flying saucer from the event, or soil samples that were somehow different than the surrounding control area, and that would smack of some interference, something that had happened to alter the chemical components of the site, for example. And then you're dealing with the eyewitness testimony, and you're dealing with photographs. And as Grant certainly remembers, we dealt with slides just a few years ago. But in each and every case, you have to check them out, and you have to rely on professional verification. You have to deal with labs. You have to deal with scientists within certain, as far as disciplines. So we're dealing with archaeologists, we're dealing with anthropologists, we're dealing with pathologists, forensic experts. And if there's one thing I've learned throughout the course of the Roswell investigation, I believe in science. I've lost a lot of faith in scientists, because so much of what they voice is nothing more than their professional opinion, right or wrong. And as a result, you are still the one stuck and responsible when they are in error. When they encourage you, oh, yes, 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 this looks good. This passes all the mustard. This is not a an image of a human being, that type of thing. And not being a scientist, I am forced to, again, rely on their expertise. And I'm not going to apologize for a second that we have at times jumped the gun. But it wasn't out of being overly zealous. It wasn't out of being overly biased that we were willing to accept any explanation, no matter which way it fell. We always felt, I mean, that we performed due diligence, that we spent years going from one scientist, one expert to another. And then, you still have to rely on professional opinion because you don't have the genuine article. It's not like you have the actual cadaver. It's not like you have the actual negatives of the photographs to determine their provenance. It's not like you have a fragment of an alloy that is 100% manufactured elsewhere. It's never been that cut and dry. It's always been rather gray. So mistakes have been made, but then such is the case of an investigation. Things remain fluid. The moment you pronounce something as, I swear to this, it is my 100% verifiable position that this is exactly the smoking gun as we've ever, worked towards or desired it. And so there's always going to be some fudge room, some room for error. And that it's not done intentionally as much as it's done professionally. Because I can assure both of you, if we ever come upon a piece of physical evidence, for example, that is beyond a shadow of a doubt, say it's memory material that I could present right here this afternoon, and no matter how often I would do this, as far as crunching it, crumbling it, creasing it, folding it, hold a lighter to it, take a steak knife and try to whittle on it, and it always returns back to its original shape. And then to really demonstrate something spectacular, I pull out a 38 pistol and then I hold it where it's not going to ricochet, and I fire a bullet, and you see that the bullet ricochets, off this paper thin material. I think it would impress everyone that, my God, we don't have anything like that. And so I could then confidently say, we may be on the border of possessing something that demonstrates extraterrestrial. It demonstrates the technology beyond our own. And so, as close as we would like to say we've come at times, it's always been with reservation. It's always been with a reliance on the scientific community. And sadly, to date, we've always come up short. So here we have this journal that has been demonstrated to be circa 1947, down to the paper, down to even the ink. It's not ballpoint pen, for example, it's cartridge pen. So it's with an old style, and Grant, you would remember as far as where you put the ink cartridge in, and you'd have the needle point as far as, and the ink would actually flow to the actual. So depending on your stroke, it would tend to bleed. You could smear it easily. The paper would show all types of telltale signs indicating that it was a actual liquid ink, not a gel or anything of that sort. And that has all been established with this journal. So the paper checks out, the ink checks out, circa 1947. So then it comes down to, well, whose handwriting is it? Is it truly, as was found in his personal effects, the journal from that very time period, or surrounding the Roswell incident, the journal of then Major Jesse Marcel, who was the head of intelligence of the 509th Bomb Group, stationed at Roswell Army Airfield at the very time of the crash? So History Channel had me provide samples of as many officers who were at headquarters as Marcel was at that very time. So I provided handwriting samples of the very base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, the provost marshal, Edwin Easley, the base adjutant, Patrick Saunders, even Ramey's, Blanchard's boss, General Roger Ramey of the 8th Air Force. So I even provided handwriting examples from all of these officers who would have worked with or worked as part of this operation at the time. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they already have determined that the journal was not written by Jesse Marcel. Then, as the question was raised, why was he holding on to this? And then, as one would anticipate, an intelligence officer in writing, or at least securing and retaining such a journal, is it possible that it was written in code? Because that's precisely what intelligence officers, their very speech pattern. It's almost like a baseball coach giving signals on, the first and third baseline, to the players. And so what were there portions of it that were written in code? And that's what's going to be breaking tonight on this episode. And I think it's already been demonstrated that it was written in script. And at one point, immediately after the incident, immediately after the balloon press conference in General Ramey's office at Fort Worth, Texas, it's no longer written in script, it's written in block letter. Well, that's kind of odd. Who does that? So there are questions of a capital M that is in the middle of a particular word, and is it an actual capital M, or are they 3 sevens in a row? Mm-hmm. Well, then I raised the question, and I don't even know if they're going to consider this evening. Well, the incident happens on July 7th, the 7th month of the year. And then when is the military alerted to this? And when does Marcel first go out to investigate this? On July 7th. And the year 47. Okay, so 777. So it was that intended as some cryptic, message for the time. I think it's something that is going to be looked at even beyond this final episode. I think that because they've determined that as many as 3 people may have written in this journal.
Wow.
That was the first thing that I was informed about, that there are 3 possible handwritings in this journal. Why is that the case? Again, unless something important was being compiled, mm-hmm. something beyond. Now, it clearly doesn't mention a word about the crash. Mm-hmm. But just as writers such as Tom Clancy and Grant, you remember like Jim Marrs, the late Jim Marrs. Yeah. And they very often, it's not what they said, it's what they omitted. It's what you would read between the lines that they would give away. Clancy was especially famous for that he would most often write his fictional novels playing out as far as all of these secrets, all of this inside information. And the only way he could do this is by writing a novel, writing it and portraying it as fiction, when in reality, he was constantly being, called as far as on the carpet, so to speak. Now, where did you get that information? How did you know about that? Well, it's a work of fiction. And they go, no, it's not. You're giving away secrets again. And so that's what people in the know, in an effort to invite others to other whistleblowers, so to speak, So it's become a modern style of whistleblowing. And who knows that this journal may actually portend some earlier whistleblowers back in 1947. And it was the only way they could get out certain information. Maybe it's nothing more than steering us in a certain direction. Maybe it's to give away a particular file number at the National Archives, for example. Who's to say at this point? But again, the fact that it appears to have been written by 3 different people. It has a script and then a block handwriting, and the fact that there are capital letters sprinkled throughout the time in question. And I don't know anybody who writes like that. You know, it would be like printing out something in lowercase and then right in the middle of it, you have a capital M. And you don't know if it's a capital M or 3 7s in a row, that type of thing. So it's fascinating, it's intriguing. It was saved by Major Marcel, who retired a lieutenant colonel. And one of the things that will also be coming out tonight is what appears, as we long suspected, that Marcel actually hid some wreckage. He hid some material.
Wow.
And you will actually have a witness that Marcel described this to before he died. And so one of the things that I then suggested was, okay, again, thinking as an intelligence officer would have, and Marcel, in knowing his days were numbered, would he have just left such evidence in its same hiding place, or would he have moved them? How would an intelligence officer look at the situation, and then what would they do? So it's a case of this whole series has been getting in Marcel's head.
Mm-hmm.
At first, looking at the journal, if he wrote it, why did he say what he did? I mean, it's got lines from music at that time. It's got certain lines from Shakespeare. I'll give a good example. And it was one of the reasons that I was a little upset with last week's episode, the second episode, because they included the late Frank Kaufman, who we had discredited over 20 years ago. We demonstrated that he forged documents, he did cut and paste stuff as far as military documents, and we proved all that posthumously after he was gone. Well, we found all the originals, and I remember going, through his office and then pulling out desk drawers and reaching up underneath and then finding a satchel of all these other documents, while someone else was distracting his wife at that time, and I'm ransacking his office. Well, we suspected him, strongly at that time, and here we were, committed to prove that he indeed was not legitimate. Well, History Channel, the producers included him as a witness to the bodies last week. And the position is, he's just one more individual who makes a claim, and it's up to legitimate investigators and it's up to the audience to decide who is legit and who is not. Well, I disagree with that, because that's what policing our own, work is all about. It's one of the reasons that, all 3 of us, we could be on the hot seat at times only because we talk to certain people. But when we clearly have demoted someone or demonstrated that someone is a non-witness, there's no reason to ever include them again.
Right.
But Kaufman would flash around this envelope, and it had only his picture on it. No address. And it was postmarked in Washington, but it just had his picture on it. And he would claim that with just that photograph, it arrived like a regular piece of mail. They knew exactly where it was to go. Frank Kaufman in Roswell, New Mexico. The storekeeper, the one that was overlooking, the situation long after the cleanup, long after all the dust, settled, that type of thing. And inside the envelope folded and shaped like a triangle, like the shape of what he claimed was the ship. And then it had coding on it. 7 + 7 = 4, the same today as before, that type of thing. And had a sketch on it that supposedly depicted the arcing of the ship coming down and then the desert, that type of thing. And then it had, I believe it was it was a number, something -E. Well, we did a Google search on it at that time, and it came up with the title of a hymn. Now, Kaufman had been raised Catholic, and we did not know that when he married his wife Juanita, she was Methodist, that he had converted over to becoming a Methodist. So then it all made sense that this was an old Methodist hymnal that had like 136E as coded as far as on that document. And the title of the hymn was, "Thou whilst comest from above." That was comest from above. And I'll never forget Tom Carey, my partner, he was with me. And we were sitting at the Roswell Inn having breakfast that morning. And luckily there was a wall immediately behind Kaufman's back. And we're sitting there, and all at once I go to Kaufman, I go to Frank. Frank, tell us about that old Methodist hymn, "Thou whilst comest from above." And he completely tips back on his chair against the wall. And he's just totally dumbfounded. And then finally he pushes back and he leans across the table and he goes, "Damn, you guys are good." So he was giving it away.
Yeah.
So we have learned enough that very often what is not clearly visible to the naked eye, you have to, very often, it's like Cavett, who was also portrayed in last week's episode. And he was head of counterintelligence, CIC. He was with Marcel when they first went out to the debris field. And very often what Cavett didn't tell you, we would come away going, he knows the whole truth. And it's what he's not telling us. It's because he's not telling us. It's that important to him.
That's so interesting. All of this is, I'm soaking it all in and I'm trying to listen and take a little bit of notes at the same time. But, going back to the journal for just a second, like just to focus on what you said about it being kept secret and having maybe 3 different handwritings in it. And yeah, my mind started to speculate right there. Why would you keep a journal like that? It's because you're discussing things that you do not even want to discuss on the phone or in person. And this might lead to a case where the 3 individuals in this did know each other well enough to be able to bring things up and discuss it in sort of a subcode, or it's a game that they would play to be able to figure out what they wanted to convey, at least. So that's fascinating to me.
You just made a good point. It could have been a game. In the sense that who's the first to break it, if there is a code, a cryptic message contained therein, or who's the first one who gives it away? Who's the first one that can't keep his mouth shut long enough and finally just, cries out from the top of the roof that it did happen. We were part of the recovery of an actual, flying saucer back in 1947. And again, why did Marcel keep it? It's not even his journal. Why did he keep it?
Well, that might have been part of the bargain. Maybe Marcel was the last one to survive and he ended up with it. And for the game to continue now, we have to figure it out. So How wonderful. Like,
We had a hunt for a diary of one of the ranch families.
mhm.
And even if it would have given the weather of the night in question, because we finally were able to establish through the old weather records from the Stallion lookout post, the like the fire towers in the Capitan foothills, the Capitan Mountains, the southern ridge of the Rockies. And so they made, as far as they would log the weather conditions at the time. And that's one of the ways we were able to corroborate what the ranchers described, that there was this just wicked thunder and lightning storm the night in question. And as ranchers described to us, that between the thunderclaps, they heard what sounded like an explosion.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's the next morning that the ranch foreman, Mac Razzo, is out riding and with a 7-year-old Timothy D. Proctor, and they discover this huge debris field, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we were hoping that this family diary would not only make some mention of the weather that night, but also what had gone down, so to speak, excuse the pun. And when we finally arrived at the ranch house, they treated us like Tom Curry would often say, they treat you like revenuers, like you work for the government.
Mm-hmm.
And we would be in a suit and tie. We were being professional. And these were ranchers, these were hired hands. And they to this day, they dress like cowboys.
Right.
They even on their horses, they have a Winchester, like a 30-30, strapped to the horse bridle, and they carry 6 guns, depending if they're out hunting rattlesnakes, that type of thing. And they look just like you expect them to look, even after all these years. And when we went through all the diaries, and there was a whole section from the 1960s, a whole section from the 1950s. But guess what section again happened to be conveniently missing? The 1940s. And so just as at the time, we have dozens of descriptions of how the military did a house by house, ranch by ranch. They confiscated everything and anything related to the incident. The radio stations, the newspapers in Roswell, every bulletin, anything, any mention of the incident was confiscated by the military. So one can imagine that here was a diary. Here was something that may have potentially mentioned anything about the situation, and it too, conveniently gone. So that's another thing that has been just terribly frustrating all these years, that the paper trail, they have been as meticulous, all again demonstrating just how important this event had to have been. It would have been no problem for them to leave remnants of a weather balloon out at that site or anything else conventional. We have military accounts, for example, that they were going out there for over 2 years after every heavy rain. They were making sure that they still would scour the area in question and make sure they had every last shard of evidence. So they clearly have done it with diaries, with logbooks. And in this particular case, because up front, there's no mention of the incident, you would think there would even be mention of the fact that, well, yeah, we kind of got caught with our pants down, we overreacted, and we claimed something was a flying saucer. We put out this press release, and it turned out, jokes on us. There's absolutely no mention at all. The days in question, the weeks thereafter, it's as though, as again described by all the high-ranking people down to the enlisted men, As Marcel himself, after that balloon press conference in General Ramey's office, he was told by General Ramey, I don't want to ever hear this brought up again, as though it never happened. And that's where, as intelligence officers, you would think they would write something in a particular code or as far as script that at least, again, would point in a direction. So even after the show, the final episode, that will not necessarily be the final investigation on this diary, because when you cannot break a code, you go to the next person, the next cryptologist, with the hope that, and Grant certainly knows this, that codes often have taken years to break, and many people expertise involved to come to it, just like the Ramey memo. And we have literally had dozens of forensic experts and optics metricians, look at that memo, and each one of them has another opinion.
Right.
But there's only one truth.
Okay, can I ask, Don, can I ask a question? Can you, for people, I haven't watched this story as close as you guys have followed it. Can you go through sort of the background of where this diary came from? And then the other question I want to ask you, because you and I have done some TV stuff, what kind of control do you have in a big story like this? Because if this thing sort of goes south, you know what happens.
Oh, yeah.
They're coming after History Channel, they're coming after you.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you do in terms of a big story like this, where I know I did one, I can't remember which network it was with, but when they were giving me stuff to say, and I'm saying, like, where'd you get this from? They said, oh, it came from your website. And I go, like, no, I'm not going to say this. And then I said, well, who wrote this? And they showed me this 25-year-old girl who had written the script. I said, she wrote the script. And you know what the problem is that so what kind of precautions do you take, like when you're dealing with big networks, when you have a big story like this, it could either make you or break you?
Excellent question, Grant, because we have dealt with it personally. And then we are the ones who are then left to do the damage control. And one of the ways I did it with History Channel was, I don't want to know up front. I can honestly say that I have been kept in the dark 100% with the journal. When I watch it this evening, I will see for the first time as the audience what at least this effort, this attempt to determine the provenance of the journal, I will be like one of the audience in that regard. What I provided them were things that I could vouch, I could verify, witnesses that I felt had passed muster, as I mentioned earlier. And so I still realize that, and I was concerned about that when they included some video commentary by Frank Kaufman.
Yeah, that's
that I was going to be hit, Don, you guys are the ones who broke it. Why are you now? What, you certainly can't be endorsing him. And my explanation is, if I would have known, we would have nixed it in a second. That's the problem. Anyone who deals with these networks, they have their own writers, they have their own production companies. Mm-hmm. And more times than not, the consultant never has final script approval. When you see things for the first time, as I said, you're just like any one of the audience. So welcome to the club. And our colleagues who have worked under similar situations, they relate, they empathize, they know, they've been there, that we have very little control as far as creative license in that regard. Again, we can vouch for what we have provided them, but what they insert, what they edit out, I think a wonderful example, probably the worst example I could cite, was the NOVA program on PBS. Going back to, you're talking now over 35 years ago. And it was one final interview with J. Allen Hynek. They completely edited out all of his interview claiming that he was a senile old man and you couldn't believe a word he was saying. Well, we were outraged because that was at a time that Alan, Dr. Hynek, was still very much, with it, very much in control of his faculties. He was not, he would slow down after getting into the second part of a 2-hour lecture, but he still, was totally lucid. It was just their way of, sweeping him under the carpet. But what was worse was they took our chief investigator, Alan Hendry, and they did a standard interview. Then they inserted different questions to the answers he provided. So he came across in the program as a complete skeptic. So that is just how malicious and unprofessional and fake, to use that word, they can be. So
how much is edited out? Like, that's what surprised me is people don't realize you can give like a 3-hour interview and you're in for like 15 seconds or something.
Precisely. That whole Peter Jennings debacle. They spent 4 days shooting with us in the field and they didn't use a second of it.
Wow.
A week before, Stan Friedman could have vouched for the fact that the producer, who looked all of 16 years old, and she's bossing us around, and Edgar Mitchell, the late doctor, Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell was with her, and they were not interested in even talking with him. And they, at the last minute, they asked Stan and myself, can you provide us with whatever B-roll you have from other interviews, other programs? So that entire Roswell segment on the Jennings primetime special on UFOs is CBS, NBC, BBC. It wasn't a single second of ABC Peter Jennings because they decided we're not going to, we're not going to admit that we filmed any of this. Blame it on these other, networks. They did it.
We do hear this brought up often. We do hear this editing factor brought up often, whether it's for TV or even for a film like James Fox's The Phenomenon that just got released. There was so much due to time constraints on how a feature film will play, so much that got edited out. And it is a shame. We hope that whenever we're a part of a project like this, Well,
with James, and as much as I was involved in the production, when we filmed in South America, and then when we filmed in China, we had to even omit the Chinese portion because again, we just ran out of time. Even the Westfall incident down in Australia, which they even call their Australian Roswell. And I've been there and I've talked to the witnesses as well. James didn't even know about the case till I told him after they had found, as far as in Zimbabwe, as far as that African incident with the children, that, James, there's a case that very much resembles that happened in Australia 30 years before.
Right. I've heard him speak on that, but he's never name dropped that it was you to guide him in that right direction.
Well,
so that's
not
interesting.
What we do. That's not what we do.
Right.
It's the case of, I think it was one of the presidents that ever said that the moment you start becoming concerned about getting credit for everything, nothing gets done. So as I've often said, if any one of us wins on this topic, we all win, correct?
Right.
And so that's why we need to stand with one another. And we can't all, work on the same cases. We can't all be there, to spearhead any particular efforts. So we need to encourage one another, whether we're on the sidelines or in the game itself. And
absolutely.
we just want to be at the finish line when it all happens.
I will say, I think everybody does go into projects like this with the hopes that, the full scope of it will be embraced and used and, well received. And it is a shame when a lot of it ends up on the editing room floor, especially when you don't have your hands all the way in a project like you pointed out. But after our last...
But just quickly, just imagine with James, we had over 60 hours And most of it was even talking head. When I think of just all of the experts who were interviewed, and then politicians, such as Senator Mike Gravel, and there was a congressman who we talked to, and Father Robert Spitzer of the Magus Guild in Los Angeles, the lead Jesuit scientist under Pope Francis, that type of thing. And that's one of the reasons that James is certainly hoping that he can get it sold as a series, and certainly get it produced as a DVD collection, that type of thing. But one thing, and even redressing and getting back to Grant's question, that has to be considered. We filmed Principal in January and February of this year. And then what happened in March? The whole COVID thing. And we were completely shut down. And so there were trips, there were major segments that we were still planning on filming. And the idea that we still had an order from the History Channel, which was originally for 6 episodes, 1 hour each, which they then decided to go with 3 2-hour. But nonetheless, we had to fill 6 hours. It's not like a 1 hour documentary or even a 2 hour, which are rare. We got a series. We have 6 hours. And we didn't have all the principal filming done that was necessary. So I'm very satisfied to date that they were able to pull this off, and that hopefully with a season 2, we'll not only be able to revisit some and much of what we've already introduced, but then believe me, we have much more on the table. They had me originally provide about 15 hours or 15 episodic themes for a multi-season series. So we shall see where it goes after tonight.
Right. And I will point out that this interview isn't going to air until tomorrow. So we're not giving any spoiler alerts. And if people do tune in and watch it this evening, we're not wrecking it for anyone. But just to switch gears a little bit, Don, and maybe in a more playful manner, you've collaborated on so many documentary style films. And after our first interview, I kind of went back and started looking at different things you have lended your expertise to. And one, not documentary style, but entertainment style TV show was actually called Roswell in the early 2000s, I believe, or it might have premiered in 1999. And this was right when I was in high school and going into college, and it was completely under my radar. But I went back and I watched all 4 seasons. I think it was 4. And it really took me by surprise. I mean, I know it was a teenage drama, but now looking at it 20 years later, and this is kind of anniversaries, we have a few spinning around. This TV show, I believe Project Blue Book officially closed 51 years ago.
She froze up for you, Don?
Yeah, she froze up.
Oh, no.
Well, let me get a question in while she's, there she's coming back here.
Am I coming back?
Oh, she's frozen again. So she's ready to break something. One question you can go until she comes back on. I'm always interested. You guys did a lot of work on the memory metal piece at right.
Oh no.
Nicole, you're breaking up. So can we get it? Can you describe, while we're waiting for Nicole to come back on, the whole final situation with the nitinol? And one question I've always had about, and it's about metal, because I've seen a lot of metal pieces. I've got a few people have sort of claimed they came from certain things. The thing that always surprised me about the metal pieces is that you have a memory metal piece that you can take a sledgehammer and you can't break it. And yet every time you hear a UFO crash, the pieces are all in little tiny fragments about the size of a thumb. Have you ever wondered why that bizarre thing happens? It's almost like they're dropping it on purpose. Like I was dealing with at one point with Tyler D, this NASA guy, and they had another site they were working on, and they were referring to it as the gifting site. Have you ever gotten into that thing about how the metal got, was it really a crash, or go into that for a bit. I'm very interested in the especially the memory metal, because you guys were really pushing at one point with the memory metal and trying to solve that whole thing. What happened at Wright-Patterson? Were there reports done on it and stuff like that?
Absolutely. Well, it's something that even my scientific director, Mark Rodiger at QFOS, even suggested early into the Roswell investigation, that what if this was just planted? What if, to soften the blow, so to speak, that out in a very remote region of the high desert of New Mexico, where it's, totally unthreatening to society, that you would place, wreckage and a number of cadavers demonstrating their mortality, that they're just as, biological as we are, so to speak, that type of thing. And it would be the least directly threatening situation, as juxtaposed to landing on the White House front lawn, that type of thing. And as to even demonstrated some of the motion pictures through the years. And so it was always an interesting concept and a way of looking at things. But then obviously piecing it all together, and considering that even Blue Book had determined that there were more UFO sightings throughout New Mexico, especially because it was the hotbed of all research. 2 years before, the first atomic bomb had been detonated, as far as at White Sands, just a couple hours west of Roswell. The 509 bomb group, the first atomic bomb squadron at Roswell, all the captured German V-2 rockets being tested at White Sands. So everything was focused on New Mexico at that time. And so to us, it was simply a case of someone else was very interested in our military potential at that time. And so for all the sightings, severe lightning storm, if that had anything to do with it, maybe that was the very reason that this object had exploded, and it rained debris that covered an area of almost a mile long, that type of thing. And I ask people to consider our metals, the way we would combine as far as certain alloys to create a specific, raise the tensile strength of a particular material. And where we were in 1947, and then where we are today. Well, back in 47, we might be, at this level. And then today in 2020, we've advanced to this level. Well, anything that's manufactured, anything that's malleable, if you can put it together, you should be able to take it apart. And as a result, if it's something that is still man-made, so to speak, it would still have a fracture point. It's got a stress point. And whatever happened back in 1947, it reached that level. It reached that point, whether it was an internal malfunction, or it took a solid blast from a lightning bolt. And if it's electromagnetic propulsion, just imagine the combination. You're a flying lightning rod, and just the joining of the two. We can only speculate, but whatever happened, whatever caused it to break up, it reached that fracture point, well beyond their own, but nonetheless. That's why I'll say it was nearly indestructible based on the eyewitness. When people say, oh, it was indestructible, no, nearly, it still broke up, but it reached that limit. And again, not having the material in hand, we have to, again, based on the eyewitness testimony, such as like General Arthur Exxon, when he talked about at Wright Field at that time, at the Foreign Technology Division, which was T2 back in 47, and the type of testing that was done. And he described how they would take something and just put it like in a vise, and they would just bend it back and forth, and you would think after a while, any other metal would certainly snap, it would break. And this stuff wouldn't, it just always would spring right back to where it originally was. So no matter how we tested it, firing a bullet, we had a metallurgist that described in the mid 80s, he was from the University of Florida in Miami, and they were assigned to a project by the Air Force. at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And military officers arrived. They had these large wooden cases. They put them down on the tables and said, we want all this material tested. We'll be back in a week for a full report. And he describes how they took this piece of memory material that they suspended it within a firing chamber, and he fired a 45 caliber shell into it. And he said it was like a tennis ball hitting a blanket on a clothesline. It sprang forward, and then as the material came back, and the shell just dropped right off of it. You know, it creates just a tremendous visual. But he was there. He was firsthand. And he said there was absolutely no doubt that they were dealing with something manufactured off the planet. Again, that's why we have made, after all these years, every effort to come into possession of the genuine article. The first episode of the History Channel, they interviewed Joe Brazel, who is the grandson of the very ranch foreman, Mac Brazel, who's, you know, the principal witness in all this. Well, they mixed up the story of the Marcel residence and the patio, the concrete slab that had been poured just weeks before. We even checked back to the building permit, and it was there. And we believe because the bushings, the ground had not been filled in around the outer edge of the concrete, that you could slip something underneath. Well, somehow the writer confused that story with the Brazos and a concrete slab at one of the ranch houses. Well, I had to go back to Joe Brazel and say, I'm sorry you got involved with that, but they didn't get that story from us. Mm-hmm. And as you're dealing with a lot of pieces to a puzzle, I don't expect them to get it right. I really don't. But right. That's also our fallback. The story is that complicated. That many witnesses involved that they're not always going to be on the same page as we are.
But you had done the work at Battelle. You had to recover some reports, right?
Right.
And can you get into, you wrote a book on Wright-Patterson. Do you think the stuff is still at Wright-Patterson, or do you think like the Area 51 or? So give me that whole scenario.
Okay. It was mostly through the work of our colleague, Anthony Bergalia, who he's a pit bull. I mean, he just does not take no for an answer. Yeah. And when we, obviously, as everything came together, the fact that here General Ramey with the weather balloon press conference in Fort Worth, he cancels the resumption of the flight on the Wright field for the testing of the material. Well, it's just a weather balloon, here it is right in my office. I'm not, nothing to be tested, nothing to see here, that type of thing. Well, we know it all went on the Wright field. The actual material went to Wright field. The Pentagon even, mentioned that in their very press releases. And then the FBI memo that went out at 6:17 that evening saying that we don't care what the general is saying. The material is going on the Wright field for testing, and he's claiming it's a weather balloon. That's not what we've been talking about on the phone. It's something else. So all roads lead to Ohio and Dayton, Ohio, Wright field, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And so Bergalia, because Battelle Institute, one of the most famous national laboratories in the world, but government contracted. I lectured there back in 1994. And they were assigned by Wright Field to develop, and I'll put it in quotes because it was their words, self-healing metal. Self-healing metal. Now, what does that sound like? Sounds like memory material, doesn't it? And isn't it interesting that it's just a matter of a few weeks after Roswell? Battelle is just down the road in Columbus, Ohio. And so, in fact, even after this, Hynek with Captain Edward Ruppelt, first director of Project Blue Book, they came up with Project Stork, which was doing a statistical analysis of Blue Book's UFO reports at Battelle Institute. So they wouldn't be under some of the control and the regulation of the Air Force. Here, a private lab would have greater access to some of the better cases, that type of thing. And that's where Report 14 originated with Project Stork, that type of thing. But again, Battelle has had a history of working with Wright Field / Wright-Patterson. Self-healing metal within weeks after Roswell. So Bergalia starts going after, he starts filing FOIA to first Wright-Pat. We have no records. We don't know what you're talking about. Maybe you should ask Battelle. Battelle was passing it back to Wright-Pat. This went back and forth for the better part of a year. Finally, Battelle came up with Project Report number 2, which was beginning of 1949. And it talks about the project, and it named people within the project who years later talked about handling pieces of a flying saucer. That's what made it all the more intriguing. So we pushed all the more then for, well, if there's a copy of Project 2 we want, how about we'd like to see Project 1. And we've only seen a few pages from Project 1.
Oh, you've seen some pages.
Yeah, but they're claiming that the rest of it's either been destroyed or they can't find it. But nonetheless, it demonstrates that they were making a full conscientious effort to come up with memory material. And that they came up with the nitinol, the combination as far as nickel and titanium, around 1961. And to this day, it's used strictly for surgical equipment, as far as eyeglass frames that you can twist and bend, and then they come back to the red. So you see how close we are.
Yeah.
And yet this all originated within weeks after Roswell. See, I always point out, Grant, like when General Nathan F. Twining, he signed on to that estimate of the situation, not specifically, but that letter in September of 1947, where he signed on to the position that the phenomenon is real and not visionary or fictitious. Flying saucers do exist, that type of thing, and describing their characteristics, their size and all that. What most ufologists never point out is that the people who actually wrote that letter, which was intended for General George Shelgren at the bequest of the FBI, who wanted, well, where do we stand right now? What's going on? That letter was prepared and signed. The actual copy from the National Archives was signed by all of the chief engineers at T2 at Wright Field, which became Foreign Technology Division. They were experts in propulsion, in propellers, in physical materials, aircraft materials. Now, to date, September of 47, if you only have a couple of fuzzy photographs, if you have maybe a number of scrambles pilots have described as far as some close encounters, and you've had a lot of eyewitness description of the so-called flying discs, the flying saucers. Why do you have scientists, engineers who work strictly with nuts and bolts prepare this document unless they have had access to something? And Twining signs off on it. It's his signature. And I'm amazed how many ufologists don't put 2 and 2 together. That you just can't disqualify the fact that why is Twining relying on people who would be most interested in the physical characteristics of an actual flying saucer, actual disc? And so it all points to the fact that they couldn't comprehend the material. They couldn't find the on button, as you've heard me say in the past. And they have to piecemeal it out into the private sector more and more. Battelle was the beginning of that. And since then, we've had firsthand witnesses at RAND, at Hughes Aircraft, at General Electric, at Bureau of Standards, at Battelle. And so that's why when I'm asked, where is the material today? And I would say that from all indications, and even from some of the eyewitness testimony at Wright Pat, most of it was shipped out by the early 80s. One of the colonels who was a deputy director, deputy base commander, told us that they were having a hell of a time being in the middle of a city, shipping things in and shipping things out. And they just realized this is not the place. And so from all indications, everything is gone. And that's why today I would suggest that it's these very corporations, even where Eisenhower was warning us about the military as far as industrial complex, that they're the ones who are now calling the shots, even over the military. They produce all the aircraft, all the missiles, all the ships, all the tanks. And I would point my fingers directly at them and say, they have the Roswell wreckage today. They're still trying to see what makes it fly.
Beautiful. Now here, I'll give you one last question, then I'll hand it back to Nicole. Jacques Vallée was, if you heard recently, he was on the Joe Rogan show, and he started talking, and Nicole can sort of clarify on this, whether I've got this right. He started hinting about the 1952 piece that was shot off over Washington, D.C.
Right.
And he didn't really want to talk about it. That piece came to Canada. I knew a lot, and I provided some of the material to Jacques Vallée. The Canadians talked about it. He seemed to indicate that material had gone to Battelle. He was hinting that it had gone to Battelle as well. So has Vallée ever been involved with your metal stuff? Because he's done a lot of metal stuff. Has he ever gotten into that? And what did he take of it?
Right. And Jacques was also involved. Peter Sturrock and Jacques also possessed pieces from Ubatuba as well. And what was interesting is that when Jacques provided a piece to Dr. Michael Swords and Dr. Mark Rodiger, and when it was analyzed, they weren't aware of the fact that, and especially when we looked at it under a microscope, that it very much resembled some of the fragments that have been recovered at the Roswell debris field. And so it was like we were looking at identical as far as samples. And who would have predicted that? And so the problem, and Jacques was the one who recommended to me years ago, he'd go, Don, why don't you guys stage a fake find out at the crash site and then see who you bait, so who comes out and tries to, retrieve it, confiscate it. And I would comment yes, and somebody would get hurt or worse over a hoax. And he would go, yeah, that's pretty silly. And so, yeah, that's a silly recommendation, that type of thing. As you know, Grant, Jacques pretty much gave up on the nuts and bolts, 40 years ago. And it's one of the things that he lost a lot of faith from his ufological colleagues, in that he was getting into more and more of the Alice in Wonderland type of psychic projection phenomena, the ultra-terrestrials, the type of interdimensional popping in and out. And it may indeed, that's exactly what we're dealing with. But we're going to need something physical to prove this all with. So now he's reverting back, and he agrees with that. And one of the things that Jacques agreed with me, even while before he agreed to sign on with Phenomena, as far as the James Fox film, was that he agrees with me that it's a cover-up of ignorance, that after all these years, they still don't know what they're dealing with. They don't know from where, from why, or from who. And so I'm pleased that he has come full circle. It's one of the reasons that, see, Jacques, there was even a falling out between him and Hynek over the very same thing. Hynek was becoming more nuts and bolts as Jacques was becoming less and less. Because Hynek, realizing his time was running out, he too, I need the piece of physical evidence. And what's fortunate is that this material has been preserved. because we both know of cases where whether photographs or even possible remnants, they disappeared. They've been confiscated and they've been turned in for analysis and testing and never seen again. So Jacques has certainly been loyal in that regard, and we thank him for that. But it's once again, thanks for once again resuming the hunt, Jacques, because we've never left it. Yeah. And as a true scientist, you've had to explore every possibility, and we don't fault you for that. It's just realize that we are the ones still in the field. We're the ones that are still trying to retrieve that Holy Grail. So don't come along after the fact and say, I knew it all along.
Yeah. Good. Okay, Nicole's back from missing time here.
I think everything's working right now. I knew something would happen with the three of us together. It was my turn this time.
That would happen, yeah.
But I'm glad you brought up Vallée and Hynek again, because it does sort of tie into my question, which I was leading to you, Don, sort of about this love affair between ufology and film. And, you know, Vallée and Hynek had a role in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I was bringing up the show that you kind of had a collaboration with in the late 90s and early 2000s. And
very
that
loosely,
was,
though. Whenever they would revert, they would flash back to 1947. They would fly me out to the Paramount lot, and I'd be on set. And I always say, and I hope at some point she hears this, but Katherine Heigl, one of the stars of the series, is exactly what all of her acting colleagues say. She is, she's not the nicest person to work with.
That's interesting. I was kind of filling Grant in right before you joined us and we started recording. I was telling him how the show was a teen kind of drama and it launched Katherine Heigl's career, and she was one of the aliens. But what I found most surprising is a lot of the themes that were in that show I didn't even become aware of until maybe 5 years ago within ufology. And that's what I found kind of interesting, is when you collaborate with shows like this, are there ever elements that you push or that you hope Hollywood gets correct, or maybe something that people sneak in and it's like, oh yeah, there's a Easter egg of truth? And what I was most thinking of, aside from, I think one of the best episodes was when they flashed back to 1947 and there were some character names that got brought up, like Richard Doty and some others along, where, you know, the facts were a bit mixed up, but the episode was still, you know, very well done, I thought. But other interesting elements, like you brought up Katherine Heigl being one of the aliens, and she has kinetic powers. She can move things. And her brother alien can heal people. And I found it quite interesting because 20 years ago, I was digging around in ufology, looking at case reports and things. And these elements, you know, surprised me because I hadn't come across them really until the last 5 years. So can you comment on maybe little snippets like that, and whether you think they get certain aspects right or if it's just completely wrong?
Well, as the famous scientist Arthur C. Clarke would comment, that in our own perception of life from another planet, we should anticipate that it will be like magic to us. And it's one of the reasons I'm an aficionado of magic, good magic. Whenever I've been with Paul Davids, who does a wonderful, he was executive producer on our Roswell movie, and he's become just a wonderfully entertaining magician. And he belongs to the Magic Castle in the Hollywood Hills. And so whenever I would be there, I make it a point. I need to get to the Magic Castle because I don't want to know the secrets. I want to be all and inspired and just go, my God, how did they do that? Because that's where, when we think, it's like the old mistake that even Jacques has made in the past. You try to think through alien eyes, so to speak. It's a faulty premise. It's no different than they would try to think through our eyes. There's, unless we're talking time travel, if you're talking that we've been seated here, that we are connected by our DNA, that type of thing, we're not in a position to elevate or demote, in their case, ourselves to the point that we know exactly what one thinks, why they behave the way they do. And as a result, while the late skeptic Phil Klass, and really not skeptic, but debunker, Philip J. Klass, well, certainly they would have done this, and certainly they should have done this, and I'm sorry, again, the premise is faulty at the very start. But I think the reason that we weren't so concerned about the Roswell TV series getting into, the whole fictional aspect of what alternative possibilities there were is because we did the Roswell movie in 1993. We filmed it in the fall of 93, and then it premiered in July of 94. And that was our first attempt at dramatizing the incident. We had the movie, which starred Kyle MacLachlan, Martin Sheen, Dwight Yoakam, and Kevin Randall and I. It was based on our first book. So then we were technical consultants on the pictures. So we were there for all the exterior and there for the interior filming. And we had a wonderful rapport with the cast and crew. But that was our baby because it was based on our book, whereas the Roswell TV series was a totally fictional adaptation of what had transpired in 47 and incorporating certain elements from the actual case, but just to create new storyline for new episodes. They had that diner that they often retreated to. Mm-hmm. And I sat in that diner on one occasion, and they had a lot of material. They had our books, in the display cases and things, and they had pictures up on the wall. And so when we received word that the series had been canceled, I immediately called up the producer, and it's like, well, they're going to trash all of that, all those props. We'll take them. We'll take them for the museum down in Roswell. Mm-hmm. And she said, nope, too late. Everything's already been destroyed. Whether it had or hadn't been, nonetheless. That's how quickly they move on to the next next opportunity.
Right. We had a panel discussion the other night on TTSA, and one of our panelists was Dave Altman, and he brought up some kind of projects that are coming out over the next year or in 2021. And he mentioned another Roswell show by History Channel. And I was wondering if that was the one you were talking about, airing now as we speak, or if this was a new project in the works that you had any part to play in coming up.
There is, and he may have just assumed it was history. There are a number of other cable networks that are in the process.
Right.
And I know I'm pushing for my partner, Tom Carey, to be involved with a new series. The problem still is, how are they going to film? How are they possibly going to shoot as long as the COVID restrictions are in place? And for all of the best intentions, it would be no different than we get word that there's going to be a second season for the History Channel, Roswell: The First Witness. And even the fact that it premiered now in December, it was ready to go in September. That's when it was originally slated. And as they are jockeying to fill all these vacancies.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is, it always comes back to whenever anyone suggests that Roswell is passé, there's nothing new, no new avenues, nothing new that can be dramatized or as far as explored or investigated. There are many things that still need to be fleshed out. There are many arenas that can be, as technology has improved, that we can revisit and go back to things. It's one of the reasons that, and Grant certainly realizes this in his own research, his own investigations, that when it involves multiple witnesses, especially with government incidents, government documentation, and you have a trail of witnesses, and you always hope that each individual will lead you to a higher level and beyond, and on, you just keep going, you take as far as it can, that you then, as you speak to a new witness, it provides you a new line of questioning for an earlier witness.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that so many investigators, they don't go back. Oh, I talked to him 20 years ago. Well, did you ever go back and refresh in their memories, or provided with new material? Did you ever go back and tweak their memories with this new information? Well, no, I never thought of that. Well, but again, that's the process of investigation. It shouldn't be linear. It shouldn't be, very often it's going to go left, right, but you want to move forward. But even in moving forward, it should be circular. Mm-hmm. That as much as you move forward, you still go back. And then, but you continue, the circle continues to move forward. And I think that's the mark of a good investigator, that you never cut anyone off. It always remains in your level of a fluid investigation.
Right. And, that just brought up something in my head. Maybe I can get your thoughts on this real quick. What seems to have surfaced in mainstream media, has gotten a lot of attention, was the comments made out of Israel from the former Israeli head of the Space Department, I believe was his title. And it kind of took, I think, a lot of people in the community by surprise that it got such coverage. And then, of course, there was some retractions along the way of, oh, he was speaking to his own research and, how did they phrase it? Ufology lore.
No, I know.
So maybe just your thoughts on, how did this story get taken so seriously by the mainstream media without any kind of background?
Right. Well, I think it was first of all, it broke the recent news cycle that leading up to the American, as far as leading up to our presidential election, and now the aftermath, that it kind of jumps into the entertainment cycle, so to speak, and it's not intended to be any type of breakthrough as much as here's something to be amused by. Here's something from, as Hynek would say, the silly season, that type of thing. And we would also note that aging men very often say silly things. And so can he be taken at face value, or do they have an inside track? Well, certainly with his background, he had access. And as I was invited some years ago to speak in Israel, and then I wanted to link with a number of Israeli investigators. And I was quite surprised to learn that they really don't have anything over there. They may have some isolated individuals who are, dabbling as far as in the UFO arena itself, but there is no organization. There is nothing as far as constructed, as far as that could respond to such a statement, such a revelation. So I think it's another reason that there was nothing to counter it, except the fact that certain officials in Israel And the media in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, you know, they kind of poo-poo it and laugh it off, that type of thing. But whether we're talking about the late, as I mentioned earlier, Edgar Mitchell, certainly we could throw Paul Hellyer into the mix. And now, as far as this gentleman, the fact that they either are breaking rank, they're saying things because they realize they are running out of time, and they speak out while they feel that they still are considered reliable, lucid, that certain things could be followed up on, they could be checked out. Or is it a false flag? And I hate that term, because are they saying things just for effect, just to see what reaction they get? Now just imagine if this would have served as a springboard for someone else to say, well, if he's going to be that outspoken on the topic, well, let me tell you what I know.
Right.
You get this chain effect. And I think it's almost like getting back to Major Jesse Marcel. Here was the fall guy from Roswell. He's ordered to pose with the substituted weather balloon. I like the fact that the History Channel even had a body, you know, like our good friend Ben Hansen, who did Fact or Faked on the Sci-Fi Channel. And before that, he worked with the FBI. And one of the things he worked on specifically was body language. And as a result, those two pictures of Marcel holding up a piece of the flimsy reflective foil, the radar kite, and the look in his face, the fact that he's not looking at the camera. Well, if you don't know that there was only one photographer in the room at the time, why is he looking away?
Yeah.
Okay, so you raise questions like that. And that's where, as investigators, we have to explore every avenue of approach to put together the whole picture. Everybody else, you know, has the luxury of just looking at things on face value, and then they tell you what they believe. Well, sorry, it's just your opinion, and they come a dime a dozen. So Marcel is the fall guy. And he's told Jess, you know, in 5 years, just be a good soldier. It's all going to come out. You'll be vindicated. You'll be a hero. And he waits 5 years. Then he's told, well, 5 more, Jess, 5 more. So he waits 5 more. And then he waits 10 more. And then he's diagnosed with emphysema. He's only got so much longer. It's 30 years later, 31 to be exact, and he breaks his oath of security. He comes out. He tests the waters. And he talks about the material, the wreckage. See how the public reacts. See how the press reacts. And when you consider the tragedy, the fact that not a single legitimate media source touched the story, except for one, the National Enquirer. It doesn't get the others to line up in a hurry, does it?
Right.
It actually scares the rest of them off all the more, thinking that, you know, I better not say anything because they're gonna tear me apart just like they did Marcel. And yet, to his credit, the fact that till the day he died, 8 years later, he stood, you know, on that testimony that whatever I held in my hands back in 47 was not made on this earth, period. Okay. And he holds on to this diary. Okay. Is it somehow connected? And then we learned that he also preserved, he had pieces of wreckage. Why do you say pieces of a weather balloon for the next 40 years?
Right.
I'm sorry. Again, anyone in your audience who would consider them a skeptic I defy you to find me another example where someone has saved something as conventional as off-the-shelf weather balloon material after 40, 50, now 70 years and say, well, I knew someday it would be important. Well,
Right.
no, I'm waiting. I'm waiting.
Wonderful.
So the point being that time is an enemy to all of us.
Mhm.
And when certain people, minus the physical proof, or as I described, testing the waters, they speak out. They see what the public reaction is one thing, but they want to see what the mainstream media does with the information.
Right.
And if they are cooperative and they are supportive, if they treat you with dignity, respect, to encourage others from coming forward. But here we are after all these years, and how does the media typically treat this? That these people cannot be believed, they cannot be trusted. You know, they need to, you know, go back to their nursing homes and just shut up.
Mm.
And to me, it's even bigger than the topic of UFOs, the fact that the skeptics will trot out a 90-year-old witness if it supports their claims.
Mhm.
And I'll never forget class telling me face to face on one occasion, you know, Don, you can't trust anyone over 70. You can't trust their memories. And I went, Phil, aren't you 72? At the time. And he just gave me a smirk like, well, yeah, well.
Except
That
me.
only applies to your side, Don. Only applies to your side.
Oh man.
The last question I want to ask you has got to do with the latest sort of story that's running around, and that's the whole Senate task force.
Yes. With
And Mellon, Lou Elizondo, and Justice leaving TTSA to go wherever, and they must be going someplace where there's some money. I think Elizondo was asked just recently, did you ask about Roswell? And he said, yes, he did. Have you been involved with either them asking you questions about Roswell or with the Senate people inquiring about what you know? Because it looks like everybody's sort of scrambling now to try to put stuff in the public and get information. Have you been involved in any of this?
yes and no. And as far as you're talking about Senator Rubio's committee.
Yeah.
And that because we've been here before, whether it was with late Congressman Stephen Schiff, and even with the General Accounting Office looking in the Roswell, that for some strange reason, they were never interested in talking to actual witnesses. Well, I mean, if I'm a judge or a lawyer, in many situations, that's all I have, you know, left to investigate. I need to talk to the eyewitnesses. I need to return to the scene of the crime, so to speak. And that's what's always intrigued me about even the Clintons, and specifically Bill. When he's asked, well, did you ever look into Roswell? And he'll make comments like, well, yeah, I asked to see the documents. Well, sorry, again, there's a disconnect here. Why are you're asking to see only documents when you could say, I want to see the bodies. I want to see that material they talk about. Why would, in God's name, if I'm the president of the United States, why would I only want to see the documents? So it's either a case of, and Grant, you studied, you know this better than any of us, the idea that is a president only going to see, you know, is he only asking for the tip of the iceberg only because he's hoping just to get that much? Or is it because he truly knows, but it's all he can admit? And it's a case of, like in Clinton's case, he knows, but he can't say a word. Or he had 8 years in the Oval Office and he wasted it. And now it's too late.
Well, it may also go to your point that they really don't know.
Right,
right. They may have the material, but you don't want to say, we have no clue what's going on here.
Precisely. Because how do you go to the American people? How do you go to the world population and say, you know, we're being visited, they're flying through our airspace with total impunity. We don't know where they're from, who they are, what they want, but vote for me come next election, that type of thing. It's not the way to, you know, gain, you know, public confidence of any sort, because the government has to always appear as though it's in complete control
Especially
of
the president,
especially the president.
Yeah.
And so, I'm intrigued by the fact that Elizondo, especially, that when he's pressed on the question of physical wreckage, if we have, he admits it.
Yeah.
And I believe it's more than what Bigelow Aerospace claims that they have in their possession.
Yeah.
Luis Elizondo was talking as though he has seen something. It may not be the genuine article, but that he has seen documentation, that he has talked to people in the know who have told him, and whether he has surmised that it has something to do with 1947 vis-a-vis Roswell, or again, it doesn't matter if it's Roswell, whatever, if they have anything that finally is proven to be extraterrestrial, we win. We've been the boy crying wolf has been crying wolf correctly all along.
But he's falling back on his security clearance, right? He's saying, I'm doing my job, I'm under a security oath and all that. And it's the same, it's like a second level of secrecy.
Precisely. And that's why whenever I'm asked about Elizondo, I always advise people, don't expect too much, because he will be under a security oath for the rest of his life. There's only going to be so much that he will be able to provide, only so much that he will be able to acknowledge. I know he had dinner with screenwriter Tracy Torme a month ago. And Tracy called me right up and he said, well, Elizondo told me that something's going to break in the next 2 weeks. Well, and then, as far as for that gun camera photograph came out. Yeah. Just a few weeks ago. So he was correct about that. Now, I know it didn't get a lot of fanfare, only because to me it appears to be a balloon, and I think it's been demonstrated a Batman balloon, even the configuration of it. So is it the actual photograph? I would suggest it's not. Mm-hmm. I think, and given the Air Force's track record, I don't believe they could announce it's all real tomorrow and I would still hesitate.
Right. Which that was interesting, because that photo came out via Tim McMillan and the debrief. And then we mentioned the Joe Rogan Fox Valet interview, and actually Christopher Mellon gave a statement to James Fox to read on the air during that interview. Right. And it almost sounded like Mellon was pushing for a different picture, yes, that there was one.
There has to be another picture.
Exactly.
And like I posed the question, if you notice that the pilot is in the foreground, well, we don't know what aircraft it is, but if it's your typical fighter aircraft, there isn't a co-pilot. Mm-hmm. And so, in other words, who took the picture? The gun camera typically is for the nose of the fighter, the aircraft. So how is it that it's a picture with the pilot's side view over his shoulder?
Right.
Example?
Well, they're saying it was taken from the co-pilot's cell phone. And there's even discrepancies about whether a cell phone could be allowed. And there's been lots of holes blown into it already.
I can assure you, for all the pilots I deal with, there's no way that a co-pilot even is going to sit there so comfortably and pull out his cell phone and start taking as far as pictures of anything up at that altitude. No.
Right. Oh, the fires are getting stoked with these comments. I can see it already on Twitter. It'll be reignited. But maybe to close here, I could ask, what are your thoughts on what do you think TTA's future is with their big three figureheads kind of exiting the stage? And regardless of what they move on to, what do you think this means for TTSA?
I think they expect something coming out as far as from Hal Punnick as far as in the future. Mm-hmm. And what he intends to do. I think what Elizondo, he's been exploring for some time, international ties, as he's been to Brazil, he's been to Italy, I think he's been to Germany. He just did an interview in Germany with Robert Fleischer. And so I think he won't be under such constraints if he establishes more of an international coalition.
Right.
And I think that's what he's been looking into for some time. And that's why I think that's going to be their next play. That if he can't say certain things here, he will say it on foreign soil, or at least he will put things out for public dissemination. Mm-hmm. And once again, I think throughout the course of UFO history, very often things have been said just to either strike a chord or spark a chord of reaction. And short of being able to present the actual hardware, short of actually being able to present a full, official acknowledgement that we were truly dealing with a phenomenon off the planet, I think very often things are done just to establish a response or reaction, which then puts into place, it turns the wheels as far as the next public announcement. I like to believe, and I think it's one of the reasons that guys like Marcel were slapped right back down. And that's why there was such a lull between the next whistleblowers coming forward, and how we had to force them. We had to, make them feel that there was power in numbers. And what may indeed be going on right now, as far as with Elizondo and the others, is that they didn't get that power in numbers that they expected.
Right.
I think even within the UFO community, because we've demonstrated a lot of cynicism, because we've been down this road before. We've had these carrots dangled time and time again, only to have, be standing there alone with the egg on our faces. And some of us, we can't use any more egg shampoo. We've had enough. It's done enough.
Now, these guys sometimes watch what we're doing. So just for the record, we know that this Senate committee, but they're talking about military film, Navy film, all this kind of stuff. Just for the record, just in case they're listening, do you stand ready to testify to them about Roswell? Because that may be what it comes down to, is instead of looking at gun camera footage, which really doesn't tell you very much of anything, if you can get to the actual material and the witnesses who have actual hardware, where this hardware is, are you ready to testify to any Senate people as to where to actually go?
Well, and Grant, you were there when we had the citizens hearing in Washington a number of years ago. And I'd like to believe it's one of the reasons that we stayed in contact with 4 of those 6, was it 5 or 6?
6.
6, yeah. We stayed in contact with them years thereafter. And it's one of the reasons that 2 of them, like Senator Mike Gravel, even started attending UFO conferences. Because we obviously, we struck a nerve. They realized that, especially their capacity of being in, placeholders in Washington, that they weren't being told the truth. That there were certain truisms that were being withheld, and they didn't like that. And it's not that they were subscribing to what we were preaching, so to speak, as much as, again, they felt the need to look into the possibility that this was all being covered up for whatever reason. And they wanted to be part of the chase, so to speak. And so, absolutely, it was no different than we worked with Congressman Schiff, that we availed ourselves of whatever information they requested of us, whatever they felt would further their cause, their investigation. That certainly was what we were looking into. But I'm sure you've also been in the same boat, Grant, as far as I remember meeting with Senator or Congressman James Sensenbrenner on the MJ-12 documents. And I was right in his office in Washington. And he agreed to meet with me, demonstrating that either we're dealing with the release of classified documents, or somebody is forging documents and portraying them as classified information. And he was, yes, this needs to be investigated because we're talking about a Class A felony in either case. And he gave me an assurance he was going to investigate this fully. And then as I exited and I walked down the hallway, I walked backwards and I stepped back into his doorway as I watched him crunching them up and tossing them in his worker basket.
So, did you say anything? I would have been like, I just saw that.
No, what I did say was, you didn't surprise me, Congressman. I expected nothing more.
Yeah.
And so that's why we have to remain ever vigilant. we have to, you know, demonstrate to them that we're watching, and that if they think that they're going to continue just brushing this aside, when you do have many high-ranking officials that clearly, I mean, we know for a fact that congressmen have been briefed on this subject continuously. Lest we forget that even when Vice President Dick Cheney was asked that very question, have you been recently briefed on the subject? To which he responded, well, certainly if I have been, I wouldn't be able to say anything. So it isn't just a tacit dismissal of, oh, don't ask me, you know, about a subject that's silly. No, 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 no. They're acknowledging, they're clearly demonstrating that, as the Air Force itself used to call flying saucers, serious business. We all know it's serious. It's about time they come up to speed. And I think much of it is their embarrassment of the fact that they are not knowledgeable. They are totally unknowledgeable about this subject.
Well, I think they need someone like you, because to me, it looks like they're being directed down a road for military surveillance of Navy fighter jet investigation and stuff like that. I was like, what about the other 95% of the stuff that's there? I mean, and that's why I hope you somehow can get in there and present the other evidence that is going to actually get us somewhere.
Thank you, Grant. I truly appreciate that. And I have already been in contact, and with that, I will make sure I will continue to make every effort, because we have seen too often that it has just been a cursory examination of a few documents, and it's you're talking the biggest story of the millennium, and they need to start treating it that way.
Yeah, and the senators really don't know. I mean, they really don't know it. You know, unless somebody comes in and tells you, they think they're being told the truth. They're being, you know, they have no clue because they've never investigated before. And that's why we need some pressure to make sure that they look at the whole story and not just Navy footage and Navy reports, which is where they seem to be going.
And they have been denied, and in their capacity as elected public officials, it smacks even more sinister that the information has been withheld from them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, and black ops, you know, black operations being what they are, and that so much of, you know, ufology has been a smokescreen for, you know, other projects within the military, that the accountability still lies within Congress, and they're the ones who decide where the money is allocated. Yeah. And much of it has been allocated in the very cover-up of this very subject, and they need a full accounting.
Good.
Nice. Well, on that note, guys, I think we can wrap it up. We're approaching 2 hours here. And like Don, I was going to say, as usual, it flies by faster than I anticipate. And I did manage to work through all my questions this time. And
I'm happy.
Well, that's kind of relief, but you know, I want to have you on again in the future, and whether you could join another disclosure panel, and this time technology will allow it, or you know, we can do a part 3 solo, I hope, in the future as well.
You can count on it. I always enjoy it with both of you, and you know, you're good friends to me as well, and we're beyond kindred spirits in that we have a common goal. And that it's not that we ever set ourselves up in competition with one another, and unfortunately that happens to be most any profession. But because this subject is big enough to encompass all of us and then some,
right,
there's plenty of room for all of us.
There is indeed. And yeah, maybe next time we can pull some more thoughts on technology and corporations, and maybe where this has led. So I think that's kind of, you know, at the forefront of community chatter. So that would be interesting to dive into with you. So thank you again, Don, as usual. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Grant.
Thank you, Grant.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year.
And it has to be, it will be.
2021, here we come.
Here we come.
Okay.
Open arms.